You ever get that feeling when you see a Spitfire or a Hurricane just like soaring across the sky?
Oh, absolutely.
It's like
Yeah.
a direct link to history, right?
Oh, it really is.
The bravery of those Battle of Britain pilots.
Hmm.
But imagine if those skies just fell silent.
Yeah.
That's the reality we're facing right
Hey.
now.
Hmm.
The entire Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, the BBMF, has been grounded
Right.
since May 2024
Yeah.
after a tragic crash took the life of squadron leader Mark Long.
Sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a real gut punch, isn't it? Because these aircraft are more than just machines, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, they're symbols of courage, sacrifice,
Yeah.
and to lose a pilot like that, it really brings home the human cost of keeping these memories alive.
It does, and it raises so many questions about the future of the BBMF itself. We've
Yeah.
got sources here talking about everything from risk assessments
Right.
to budget shortfalls, even the possibility of civilian organizations taking over. Where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, let's start with that comparison the historian James Holland made.
Okay.
The one about more people being run over by buses than dying in a Spitfire crash?
Right.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it goes beyond simple statistics, doesn't it? It speaks to our perception of risk.
Okay.
We accept these everyday dangers, like buses, but the idea of a vintage aircraft crashing feels somehow more
Yeah.
unacceptable.
Almost like we're holding these planes to a different standard. Like
Yeah,
they should be immune to the realities of, age and mechanical failure.
exactly. And that's where things get tricky for the Ministry of Defense.
Sure.
They're caught between this public perception of risk, but then also this very real pressure to ensure safety. Plus, let's not forget they're dealing with a massive budget shortfall, nearly 17 billion pounds.
Right, that financial elephant in the room. So even if the MOD decides the risks are manageable, can they actually afford to keep the BBMF flying?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
We're talking about an estimated £5 million a year.
That's the figure that's being thrown around, yeah. And you have to wonder if in a time of austerity, those funds could be seen as better spent elsewhere.
Right.
It's a tough call.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that core question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the true value of preserving these historical aircraft?
Well, we know from our sources that the 1991 hurricane crash, that didn't lead to a long-term grounding.
Right.
The cause was identified quickly, flights resumed within a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
But this time it just feels different, doesn't it?
it does. And I think that's partly due to the, increased scrutiny surrounding safety, but also the fact that this investigation has dragged on for months without a definitive answer,
Yeah.
And it creates uncertainty, which fuels speculation and frankly makes it harder for the MOD to make a clear decision about the future.
And let's be honest, even if the investigation wraps up tomorrow, the planes are deemed airworthy, there's still that financial pressure looming over everything. It's almost like a perfect storm brewing,
Yeah,
A tragic accident, an ongoing investigation, public anxiety about risk, and a government struggling to balance the books.
it's a complex situation, no doubt.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that there are voices within the RAF,
Okay.
like retired Group Captain Terry Holloway, who are pushing back against this risk-averse culture. They're arguing that, these aircraft are either safe to fly or they're not, regardless of a single incident,
Right?
and that the historical and cultural value of the BBMF should be given serious weight in this decision.
So I'm curious about Holloway's perspective. You mentioned he was a BBMF engineering officer.
That's right, yeah. He's intimately familiar with these aircraft, with the maintenance procedures, the training, the whole culture of safety that surrounds the BBMF. And he seems genuinely concerned that the MOD is overreacting, potentially jeopardizing a vital piece of British heritage.
Okay, so we've got this internal debate within the RAF, coupled with the external pressures of public perception and, the financial constraints. It paints a pretty bleak picture for the BBMF, wouldn't you say?
It's certainly a challenging moment, but before we jump to conclusions, remember our deep dive isn't just about dissecting the problems.
Right.
It's about exploring potential solutions as well.
Okay.
And thankfully, there have been some recent developments that offer a glimmer of hope.
Oh, right. You're talking about that test flight and the Lancaster getting a new engine.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. So we've got a grounded Spitfire undergoing a test flight back in October,
Yeah,
and the Lancaster bomber is getting a shiny new Merlin engine
right.
this winter. Does this mean that the RAF is, quietly gearing up to get the BBMF back in the air?
Well, it's certainly a positive sign, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, think about what those actions represent. You've got these highly skilled engineers meticulously working on these vintage aircraft, making sure they're airworthy.
Yeah.
And the RAF has even indicated that most of the fleet should be ready to fly by March, just in time for the display season.
That's fantastic news for those of us who, eagerly anticipate those air shows every year.
Right.
But, ready to fly doesn't necessarily mean cleared for takeoff, right?
It's the crucial point.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The Ministry of Defense still has the final say.
Yeah.
And you can bet that they'll be weighing a lot of factors. The crash investigation's outcome, those budget constraints we talked about.
Yeah.
And, of course, public opinion. It's a complex equation with no easy answers.
So even with these positive developments, there's still a chance that the MOD could decide it's just too risky or too expensive to keep the BBMF going.
Well, there is that, isn't there?
Can you imagine attending an air show and there's this? Silence! No Spitfire roar.
Oh, I don't even want to think about it.
It'd be like, a piece of history is missing.
It would, wouldn't it? You hit the nail on the head there. The roar of those engines?
Yeah.
The sight of those planes against the sky?
Yeah.
It's more than just a spectacle.
Right.
It's a visceral, emotional connection to a pivotal moment in our history.
Mm-hmm.
And for some, especially those who lived through the war or had family members who served, it's deeply personal.
And that brings up another point from our sources.
Okay.
The potential for civilian organizations to take over the BBMF if the RAF decides it can't continue.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it?
It is.
We've got companies like Aero Legends and Air Leasing Ltd. Who already operate vintage aircraft.
That's right.
They've got the expertise, the passion, and potentially, the resources to step in.
Yeah.
But would it truly fulfill the same mission?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some would argue that a civilian-run BBMF, that wouldn't carry the same weight, the same historical significance.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, isn't keeping these aircraft flying in whatever capacity better than the alternative?
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
The core purpose of the BBMF is to honor those who fought in the Battle of Britain, to keep their memory alive, and to inspire future generations.
Right.
Could that mission still be achieved even if the RAF wasn't directly in charge?
Well, I guess it depends, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much emphasis we place on the military aspect versus the memorial aspect.
Right.
Would people feel differently about a Spitfire soaring overhead if they knew it was being flown by a civilian pilot? Would it still evoke the same sense of history, sacrifice? It's definitely something to ponder.
Mm-hmm.
But while we're, discussing this broader fate of the BBMF, let's not forget the human element here.
Yeah.
The RAF hasn't just grounded a fleet of aircraft.
Right.
They've lost one of their own.
Right. And what struck me as particularly poignant was, that tribute to Squadron Leader Long.
Oh, the repainted Spitfire. It's quite moving, isn't it?
Yeah.
To see his squadron code, LNG, so prominently displayed.
Yeah.
And his name beneath the cockpit.
Yeah.
It's,
It feels like more than just a paint job.
It does, doesn't it?
It's like a statement, a way of saying, we remember you, we honor your service.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the camaraderie, the respect within the RAF.
Mm-hmm.
And, when that Spitfire takes to the skies again, if and when it does, it'll carry with it a powerful reminder of the human cost of preserving this legacy.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about the people behind the machines, the stories they carry.
It really does.
I mean, here we are debating risk assessments and budgets.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it comes down to something much bigger.
It does. And it forces us to ask ourselves some tough questions.
Yeah.
Like, what are we willing to sacrifice to preserve our history?
Mm-hmm.
Are there some things, like the spectacle of a Spitfire in flight, that are worth the inherent risks?
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, in the practicalities of life.
It is.
But as you said earlier, history has a way of reminding us what truly matters.
It does.
And the Battle of Britain, that fight for freedom against incredible odds, it's a story that deserves to be told.
Absolutely.
And retold.
And retold, yeah.
Imagine a world where future generations only read about Spitfires and Hurricanes in books.
Right.
Where they never experience the visceral thrill of seeing them in action, hearing those Merlin engines roar overhead.
Yeah, it doesn't bear thinking about.
It would be a loss, wouldn't it? Almost like a fading of memory, a disconnect from the past.
It would. And that brings us to another interesting point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We often talk about museums as places to preserve history.
Right.
But what if the best way to honor some stories is to keep them alive?
Literally in the air.
Literally in the air.
You're talking about the BBMF's role as a living memorial,
Exactly.
and it makes you wonder, what would be lost if it were to disappear from our skies? Would it diminish our understanding of the past? Would those sacrifices somehow feel less real?
Those are the questions I want to leave you with today.
Okay.
Because the future of the BBMF isn't just about a few vintage aircraft, is it?
No.
It's about how we choose to remember,
Yeah.
how we connect to our history, and what stories we deem worthy of preserving, even at a cost.
So what do you think? Is the spectacle of a Spitfire soaring overhead worth the potential risk? Or should we accept that some chapters of history belong in museums, not in the sky? It's a question worth pondering, and a debate worth having. Because ultimately, the decision rests with all of us. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
About the people behind the machines, the stories they carry.
Right.
Here we are debating risk assessments and budgets.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it comes down to something much bigger, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And it forces us to ask ourselves some tough questions. Like, what are we willing to sacrifice to preserve our history?
Yeah.
I mean, are there some things, like the spectacle of a Spitfire in flight, that are worth the inherent risks?
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, right?
It is.
In the practicalities of life.
Yeah.
But like you said earlier, history has a way of reminding us what truly matters.
It does.
And the Battle of Britain, that fight for freedom against incredible odds,
Yeah.
it's a story that deserves to be told.
Absolutely.
And retold.
And retold.
Imagine a world where, future generations only read about Spitfires and Hurricanes in books.
Right.
Where they never experience the visceral thrill of seeing them in action.
Yeah.
Hearing those Merlin engines roar overhead.
It doesn't bear thinking about, does it?
It would be a loss, wouldn't it? Almost like a fading of memory.
Oh, it would.
A disconnect from the past.
And that brings us to another interesting point, doesn't it?
Okay.
We often talk about museums as places to preserve history.
Right, yeah.
But what if the best way to honor some stories is to keep them alive?
Literally in the air.
Literally in the air, yeah.
You're talking about the BBMF's role as a living memorial.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder, what would be lost if it were to disappear from our skies? Would it diminish our understanding of the past? Would those sacrifices somehow feel less real?
Those are the questions I want to leave you with today.
Okay.
Because the future of the BBMF isn't just about a few vintage aircraft.
Right.
It's about how we choose to remember, how we connect to our history,
Yeah.
and what stories we deem worthy of preserving, even at a cost.
Right. So, what do you think? Is the spectacle of a Spitfire soaring overhead worth the potential risk? Or should we just accept that some chapters of history belong in museums, not in the sky? It's a question worth pondering.